Hello, everybody, and this is not stop that. This is this is not a regular podcast. This is going to be my friend Concordance and I talking about the evolution of sex. It seems we came across an interesting article. Well, I say interesting, but more from a psychological perspective. This was from True Origin. Uh, Brad Harub. Oh, what, yeah, and Bert Thompson, who wrote this thing. It seems that creationists are trying their very best not to understand anything, both the complex things and the simple things. And so I've always hearing, well, if you believe in evolution, then how did sex evolve? And the arguments that they bring up, like Ray Comfort's thing, which is absolutely the worst example I can think of. You imagine that an amorphous mass of meat sat around for millions of years and suddenly grew arms, legs, and a tail, and became a male dog. And it suddenly appeared eyes, and now it has to go look for a female dog and another unrelated amorphous mass of meat that just became a female dog somewhere nearby, because they imagine that you have to have a male and a female with complementary equipment to connect and all that. On the evolution of sex, they absolutely lost when I tell them that there are animals, including vertebrates, who switch back and forth between sexual and asexual reproduction. Nothing about this is the way they imagine it to be. So, Concordance, you had a chance to read this article that we sent you, the evolutionary theories on gender and sexual reproduction.
Yeah, I actually thought parts of it were really good.
Okay.
It's that little bit that they trimmed out on purpose because it defeated their argument. So you're talking about two authors here, and I've met Brad Harub and I've met Bert Thompson. He and I share an alumni association. They're not dumb people. And I think you have to chase that out of your mind. These are two PhDs. They both have legitimate PhDs, unlike certain creationists who sort of get their PhD through the mail. So they're not ignorant. And you set that aside and say, these are not ignorant people. They are misinterpreting.
Can we fairly use the word? I mean, I've used the word, ignorant, meaning to, that is what you ignore, right?
Right. I hear the emphasis. Ignore it. Ignorant.
Yeah.
I hear what you mean. I think that in their own minds, they're entirely consistent in focusing on what they see as the strengths of their argument and just completely blowing off the defeat of their argument. It's one easy way to never lose is to never admit any of the arguments against your position. So when I read through the article, there's some really nice cataloging of the arguments for why we think sexual evolution is favored in some species but not in others. What they've sort of set aside, they seem to be thinking that they can defeat the idea that there's any advantage to sexual reproduction in any species, which is clearly not the case. But they've taken that and minimized it or just cut it completely out of the article.
What I see from creationists quite often, and I'm not saying anything about PhD creationists when that is that they seem to not want to understand anything, or they don't understand anything from a population mechanics level. Everything seems to be at the individual level. I mean, the hardest time I have explaining evolution to anybody is getting them to see it as being more than one individual turning into something else, right? And so it's always it's always in very selfish terms. What advantage is it to the individual to pass on, they pass on all of their genes. If it's an asexual reproduction, they only pass on half their genes. If it's asexual, so it's very selfish. It's at the individual level. That has nothing to do with an unintended design, such as, we know that horizontal gene transfer preceded any type of actual sex, and we know that there's some advantage to getting the genes, a half mix of genes from other organisms when it comes time for you to deal with a new toxic environment or new infectious agents or things of that sort. Am I right?
You smuggle in a lot of meaning when you use the word design. Is a rock that has been in a river for a long time designed to be in that river? Did someone decide the right shape for a river rock?
Well, what about the designers of the river itself? Somebody had to make those snaky patterns.
Right. Someone had to design the shape of the hole so that the puddle would fit in it perfectly. Right. So when you look at rocks from a river, they can be explained two ways. Either someone has gone through and selected all of the round rocks to put into the river, or there's some process that we can't really directly observe, but we can infer from what we know about the world, that the reason why those rocks are so smooth is because the action over a very long period of time of wearing away has produced this roundness. Now, is that design? In a way it is. It's form-fitting function, right? Those rocks do whatever it is that river rocks are supposed to do especially well because they're the right shape for that job, right? You see how you can smuggle in design as and differentiate between like a bottom-up process from a top-down process. Designer here, we're implying that form fits function, and the only explanation for that is that someone decided, someone from the top down said, this is how a river rock needs to look. When in fact there are other ways to explain the appearance of design in biology.
When I hear arguments for an intelligent designer, honestly, the stories, no matter how they present them, always sound to me like that Native American legend about Coyote, making the river, and Coyote put fish in the river. Well, how did he put fish in the river? Well, he just put fish in the river. But how did he do that?
Mm-hmm.
He just said there should be fish, and there's fish. Shut up.
Right. Right. Shut up, kid.
Yeah, but that's exactly how all of the intelligent designer arguments work. I mean, for whatever reason, the fixation is, and this was completely lost on me for the longest time, that the fixation is all about purpose. That that there has to be a meaning in life. That there has to be meaningless to me. I mean, I don't have that at all. So,
or at least not a goal in mind, right? The goal is not to die, but even that, the organisms don't know that. They don't know that their purpose is not to die. Or rather that their intent or goal is not to die. They really don't have that level of knowledge. So if you really want to understand sexual reproduction, there is a particular organism that I think you have to be familiar with. And it's something, what are you drinking?
Water.
Water. So it's something we find in beer and bread, right? And that's yeast. There are a number of different yeast that are what we call facultative sexual organisms. And what that means is that yeast is perfectly happy to keep budding off itself, producing identical offspring without coming into contact with any other type of yeast. There's no sex going on with that yeast most of the time. But there are special cases where two yeast get together, there's some berry white playing in the background, and suddenly you have sexual reproduction in that same yeast. So here's an organism that can take sex or leave it in its long-term propagation. So why would you think it would favor sexual reproduction? Under what conditions might it favor sexual reproduction?
Well, we're looking at things, for the reason, right? And so we're trying to talk very deterministically. I mean,
right.
What reason would a designer have to
teleologically? Yeah.
Yeah, and so if we're talking about things where we already had asexual reproduction, or I'm sorry, we already had horizontal gene transfer going on, including the type called conjugation.
Right.
There's actually a pistis going in and all that. So, excuse me, I'm getting messages here. I don't know why. Hi, Lalandri, are you muted?
Just carry on. I was just putting some points in from the next part of the segment.
Okay.
To talk about.
I look at this as being very incidental. I mean, it wasn't set in there to create the increased immunity or to speed up evolution, because obviously evolution of sexual reproduction leads to a faster type of evolution, which leads to other advantages too. But these weren't intended. I mean, it just sort of happens when a horizontal gene transfer is already part of the equation. So you just have this, by again, it's an emergent property of population mechanics.
Right. So these yeast that can take sex or leave it, that can reproduce sexually, you can induce them towards the sexual form, the form where they can exchange gametes with, or rather isogametes with other yeast by adding hydrogen peroxide or by starving them. So those are both what we might call stress, right? At the cellular level, those cells are stressed and they tend to favor sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction. But most of the time, when they're happy, they stay asexual. I had a cousin like that. So it gives us an insight into cases where there probably are advantages to sex, but given this yeast that makes essentially a choice, it only chooses sexual reproduction in response to stress, hard conditions. In the case of peroxide, it's something like oxidative damage, like we might get with radiation or sunshine, where our DNA is being damaged. It tells us actually a lot about why an organism might have chosen to, very long ago, favor a sexual reproductive cycle, right? Because we had organisms that could do both probably back then as well. Mm-hmm. So there are disadvantages too.
What are the questions that these people are bringing up in the article that they think that science somehow hasn't answered? And this, of course, is going back to another the God of the gaps fallacy. Again, you tell me that these are not ignorant people, that they're educated, have PhDs, but they're still saying that if science can't explain it, therefore magic.
Right. Which is an easy argument to make if you're talking to an audience that are ready to accept the default is God done it.
Yeah,
it does.
Right,
it lowers the bar.
What are the questions or challenges that the people are making in this article that they think that science has somehow not addressed?
Well, that's the thing, is they actually bring up most of the arguments that I would make about why sexual reproduction might have emerged. For example, the Red Queen hypothesis, which is a particular favorite of mine. Are you familiar with that one?
Vaguely.
Probably so.
Not at this level, though.
It goes back to Lewis Carroll, Alice Through the Looking Glass, and
you have to run as fast as you can to stay in the same spot.
That's right. So she grabs Alice's hand and just takes off, and you have to run as fast as you can just to avoid not falling behind, essentially. So it's the same sort of principle when you have two things competing. You have, let's say, a parasite or a pathogen like E. coli, like Ebola, and it's a very rapidly evolving organism. And then you have its host organism, which has to evolve resistance as fast as the pathogen is evolving some new pathogenicity, some new way of killing us. The problem is that in our case, in the case of sexually reproducing beings, we tend to be larger and have more complex tissue types. So we don't reproduce as quickly as bacteria. Some bacteria can reproduce double every 4 hours. There's no way we'd be able to keep up in terms of total numbers. So E. coli has picked its strategy for remaining competitive, and that is to produce just enormous amounts of offspring as quickly as possible. We don't have that as an option. What we're taking advantage of is fewer numbers of organisms, but more diverse organisms. And that's what sex allows for us, is a variety of new combinations of traits that E. coli does not have access to, because every E. coli is almost identical to the E. coli cell that it came from. So it's our way of keeping up with the Red Queen, right, in order just to avoid becoming too uniform genetically, so that one really bad bubonic plague wipes out all of humanity, or one influenza wipes out all of humanity. We're doing a better job by creating a lot more diversity with combinations of genes from different organisms producing different offspring.
Well, one of the problems that I've noticed that creationists have with this, and this is the very basic misunderstanding, where they want to imagine, and this is even in the article where they had, how did you have the evolution of an independent male and an independent female?
Right.
at no point is there an independent male or female. I mean, it's just like they said in Jurassic Park. All vertebrates are inherently female. They just need an introduction at the right developmental stage to make them male and so forth. You can have parthenogenic reproduction, which you would think the believers would be advocating for, except of course it always leads to another female birth, and Jesus was kind of a dude. But people aren't looking at the fact that spawning was the earliest way of sexual reproduction, so that they're like just casting out eggs and casting out sperm and hoping they collide together. And of course it's a simple natural selection thing. When when the frogs are mounting on top of each other, for example, in the pond to spawn right next to each other, of course they're going to have lots more success. And then of course if you can get a closer, better connection, you're going to have more success. I mean, how hard is that to figure out? And yet, and we still have where there's not an independent, completely different set. And this is obviously another problem that creationists have, being religious extremists. They don't understand that it's not a hard line male and female, that there is ambiguity, that there is just this developmental interception that changes one into the other and so forth, so that you can have developments that in a single individual where there is both, or half of each, or whatever. It's not the clear black and white distinction. Certainly not the independent organisms that they imagine it to be.
Right. They didn't evolve independently as separate events near to each other. I think that's a fairly common idea, and it probably borrows from a lot of creationist imagery of creating man and creating woman from man. This idea that they sort of had to both be in the same garden at the same time. Like I said, there are yeast who they can reproduce asexually or sexually. It sort of depends on the conditions that they're in at the time. You made reference to animals with different sexes depending on sort of their conditions, the hormones they're exposed to, their living conditions, and that's at the vertebrate level. That's fish and birds and whatnot.
I think you're referring to a series of tests that were done with, I can't remember what the type of fish was, cichlids or something, but these were in Mexico. And it was a handful of fish that normally, and even though they're vertebrates, they normally reproduce asexually. And then when you introduce like a disease pathogen, well, then suddenly they favor sexual reproduction at that point. The asexual reproducers, and they have asexual reproducers and sexual reproducers in the same collective. They're essentially the same species, but the populations within, or the divisions within that population, change demographics depending on the environment. Are there parasites present? Is there disease present? Then they're going to be sexual, and then otherwise, in the next pond over. Because these ponds tend to get divided in the dry period, so these populations are divided. So in the next pond over, if there's no sort of pathogen like that, then they're entirely asexual for whatever reason. And they can switch back and forth. So I've never been able to see why this is such a huge mystery. And the earliest mechanics of sex were already present in the most basal of all eukaryotes. So again, where are they coming up with this issue? Why is it an issue for them? And why are they saying that evolutionists are scrambling to come up with an explanation?
Right.
Why are they talking like this?
You know what? It is an interesting question, though, and for the reasons that they put out, they don't close the loop. The reason why biologists feel the need to explain why it's a fascinating question is because everyone looks at it and says, it's sex, it's man, it's woman. People relate to that, but it's so much more complicated than that. And it is a great question. It's one of the great questions in biology. You can put in a lot of terms. One of my favorites is, why do we pay the cost of males? Right? Why would we bother to create male organisms? Their only job is to spread genetic material, but they can't have babies, right? We have to feed them. The females have to sort of compete with them, and the females are perfectly content to make babies. If you take the example of I think it's the honeybee, an unfertilized egg becomes a drone. An unfertilized egg becomes a drone. A fertilized egg becomes a worker or a queen. So it's not even that there's male and female. There's sort of Jesus B and normal B, I guess. So
Now, don't the drones also have the ability to express sex?
well, I mean, they're essentially the males, right?
Okay.
So that's how you get back to diploid.
Because I mean, I've read creationist arguments on this too, where they get all upset about their, no, it's not that there's male, females, and there's drones. It just means that those are just females or something like that. I think that was what I read, was that they said that they were all females, but they just weren't the queen.
Yeah. So I guess the point is that biologists spend a lot of time explaining why sex is such an unusual and weird thing to have evolved. And creationists are then taking the opportunity to seize on that as, biologists have no clue why this. It's a great question that we don't have a definitive answer to, which is, why are all the reasons why sex evolved? Which one of them dominates? But it's not that we're clueless. It's that it's an interesting thing when you detach yourself from considering it to be normal, that it allows you to think more critically about the forces that shaped sexual reproduction. Why are some organisms sexually reproducing and others are not?
Okay. Well, what in this article, I mean, 'cause I have my own questions like gametogenesis. How do we get to the simple mechanics of dividing whether whether, and we're just talking about single-celled microbes at this point. Single-celled microbe produces either eggs or sperm. Where's that division coming from?
Say it again.
Yeah, gametogenesis, and we're saying we're going before animals now, so we're going to start with actually, are there any that are full-on sexual reproduction?
What, bacteria?
No. I'm thinking of not just horizontal gene transfer, but I'm thinking within eukaryotes. Are there single-cell eukaryotes that actually engage in actual sex, not just have the genes to do it, but that actually are sexually reproductive? Are choanoflagellates sexually reproductive?
Well, yeast engage in sexual reproduction.
Okay.
Again, there's a break point, and it's just a technical term, isogamy, where you have two equal cells fusing together, and they're sort of the gametes, the two halves, is the sperm and egg is the heterogamous equivalent.
Mhm.
But isogamy, you have two cells of equivalent form and function joining together and sharing genetic material. And I'm fairly certain yeast, I'm not a yeast biologist, but I'm fairly certain there are several yeast that are doing sexual reproduction all the time today. And you made a point earlier, and you're absolutely correct, that probably some of the first eukaryotes were sexually reproducing, at least facultatively. That is, they can take it or leave it. So then the question is, why did heterogamy evolve? That is, why do you have a sperm and an egg that look nothing alike and are produced by two organisms that are themselves different looking from each other, right? Male and a female are anatomically different, whereas two isogametes are indistinguishable from each other, except that one has a mating strain marker, some gene that the other one doesn't have, right? And in our case, we've tied, I say we, in the case of mammals, there are other things that are associated with that marker for mating strain, which we call male and female, right? The X and the Y chromosome. In the case of mammals, in the case of fish, it's different. In the case of insects, it's different again. But X and Y in our case, and there are traits that are present on X and Y that are responsible for why the two sexes tend to be associated with two dimorphic genders, right? Male and female produce man and woman, which have different anatomy.
I think it's interesting that in Evo Devo, which is a colloquial term, I guess, or a nickname for a branch of science, it shows the parallels between evolutionary development and development from a fetus in an organism, for example. That the way that the way that life forms during the lifetime of an organism shows some parallels to the way that organism evolved.
Mm.
And so we all began as sperm, and then if you look back at choanoflagellates, they are essentially sperm. So in the evolution of sex, it seemed that the sperm cells actually existed before we did, which is kind of what you'd expect.
You have to be careful. You're up against what is it? Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is
the distinction there for anybody that might want to draw that parallel was that Ernst Haeckel had this idea that when humans develop an embryo, that they go through the adult stages of all these things. You're an amphibian at one point, and you're a fish, and then an amphibian, and then a reptile, and so forth. And of course, at no point were you ever cold-blooded in any of this. Although I guess maybe you could technically call it that. There are some parallels. Okay, I have to go get my bird.
Did he escape?
Yeah, he just flew off, and we have cats all over the place. So, Lalandra, would you want to hit the talking points? You have a number of points that you want him to address. I'm going to go get the bird, and you take over, okay?
You were just talking about how ontology recapitulates, I want to say, what is it?
Phylogeny?
Phylogeny. I knew it was phylogeny, but I didn't want to get it wrong. Okay, so like when you look at it at a very basic level, sexual reproduction, everybody who does it, even multicellular vertebrates like us, we all start off at a microcellular level with an ovum and a sperm.
Right.
So a lot of even multicellular, it seems like, are adaptations to ensure the success of sexual reproduction or reproduction.
You might have to explain that a little bit more.
Like, it's like we don't pop out fully. Like in the beginning, we're not these fully formed multicellular animals.
Right.
We're microcellular, and we divide, and we use the same processes that microorganisms do. Mitosis for our body cells, our somatic cells, and to sexually reproduce, it's still at first a microcellular process. So everything that we are, it seems like, is an adaptation to ensure that our germline continues.
Sure. And it's not insignificant that scientists study meiosis, right, which is our sexually reproducing replication cycle. They study meiosis typically in yeast because the process can be then directly applicable to, you say, mammalian models.
Yeah.
Because yeast undergo the same process that mammalian cells do. And they're simpler and faster to grow, and there's some advantage over having to do everything in mice or, God help you, chimpanzees or anything like that. So yeast are a lot easier to work with. Drosophila, when we're talking about evolution of development, or zebrafish, they're all good models. But the point is that this must be such an ancestral process, a process that has been around for so long, essentially right at the point where eukaryotes diverged, that we can study it in what we might consider very distant models that are very unlike us, because the processes, as you say, are microcellular.
Right, and our last common ancestor that developed that trait billions of years ago. Mm-hmm. Sexual reproduction. It's very foundational trait. We're still doing it to a modified degree.
It might be an interesting question for a creationist if they feel that sex was designed by a creator for the creation of man and woman. Why do yeast sometimes have sex? Why do they have different gender systems? Mm-hmm. In some cases, they have multiple gender systems.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, what was God's purpose for the yeast?
And why did God give certain lizards, different parthenogenic abilities.
Right.
And I say different
Right.
parthenogenic because there actually are different parthenogenics, like in the varanids have a different type of parthenogenesis than the New Mexico whiptail lizard, the famous lesbian species,
Mm.
which is another thing, a whole other chink against the creationism argument. We have a whole species that is lesbian twins, clones, that have to go through a mock courtship in order to reproduce. That just goes against everything that those people were trained to believe, is an abomination, right?
If you
I
take
think
it back to Aron's video series, The Systematic Classification of Life, this is why he asks people, if you didn't evolve from a common ancestor, then why are you a eukaryote?
right.
And a lot of times their answer is that there's a common designer, like as if he were a Volkswagen designer and he's using some of the same parts to make different models of Volkswagens, rather than that people, or not people, but organisms give birth and pass on their genetic information.
And that of course it brings me to why is it that is it scorpions or mollusks? I think is mollusks. I can't remember which organism it is. I can't believe I'm having this problem remembering those. But you have the blue-blooded animals, and then you have the red-blooded animals. Well, why isn't there? If these are all special creations, then why don't some of them have a different type of blood? And someone will point to an exception where where we can still tell that there's hemoglobin in their ancestral or in their ancestry, and now
Right.
there's some mutation that caused a slight change, and now the blood is clear. But these don't qualify. It's not like we have mollusks where one line of mollusks has suddenly got a hemoglobin in it. It's not like we. Why do the mollusks have better, or why do cephalopods have better eyes than we do? I mean, don't we deserve to have better eyes than an octopus, for example? And people look at all these different design attributes that they want to argue for, and these obvious trial and error things that are still producing error now. And they look at these and say, well, this is indicative of a perfect designer. This is reaching, at the very least, it's reaching. They certainly don't have an explanation for anything. They're always going to assume that whatever is the way it is because God.
Yeah, one of the brilliant things about evolutionary theory is the way you can apply it to solve problems. And I'll give you an example from my own work, which is lately about the emergence of resistance to chemotherapy. There's an amazing new field of targeted cancer therapies. They are as close as we're going to get in the short run to a cure for cancer. There's amazing response rates. And that response rate lasts for 3 to 6 months. And then at some point beyond that, the resistant cancer cells emerge. And they are resistant to the targeted therapy. So the driver mutation, the mutation that caused them to become cancer in the first place, is then subsisted by this sort of second trait that emerges from the population. You've killed all the non-resistant cancer cells. So we talk about the clonal evolution of cancer. If you could come up with a model, I'm a scientist, I'm perfectly prepared to admit when I'm wrong, that would help to explain how cancer works from a creationist perspective, it would certainly replace evolution as the primary model in cancer therapy. But as it is now, we understand the selective forces that we're applying, and it actually lets us more intelligently design how to treat. What is the level of selection that we're applying? What directionality does it have? We can create these adaptive landscapes and help to understand where we are creating the motive force for the emergence of resistance. So the utility of evolution for something as important as cancer therapy can't be overstated, right? And I don't think there's an equivalent value in creation.
You're talking about,
correct. And that's the main flaw with the common designer argument. What does it explain? And
Right.
how does it help you understand the process, like of like you're saying, of cancer cells cloning?
yeah, is there a different designer for
Mitosis helps you, but
is there a different designer for mantis shrimp than there are for bunnies? Because Why are all the shrimp and why are all the crustaceans and why are any of the arthropods all the same? I mean, do they have a separate design group? And why are they competing with all these other type animals? Do we have a designer for lions or cheetahs and another designer for impalas to make them faster to get away?
How also concordance? How would that change your process of studying the cloning of cancer cells if you were to instead look at it through the explanation of a common designer?
Well, again, we're even talking about evolution of the cancer cell. You start to think of the cancer as a separate organism, or even a population of organisms, where each cancer cell is its own unicellular organism, and it's competing with every other cancer cell in a patient's body. And if you kill off all the competition, what emerges is the resistant form, right? So you can look at it as population dynamics within a tumor. And the tumor itself is diverse. So you really can't apply creationism to it. There's no value to it.
Believe it or not, we've actually gone to testify because they're always trying to sneak in creationism into Texas classrooms, and they try to. A lot of times they do try to sneak it in at the cell biology level.
Right.
Like they think that a flagellum is too complex to have evolved or whatever. And I testified to them. You're talking about people that are going to be studying cancer. Mm-hmm. Talking about people who are going to grow up to be biologists, science teachers. What value is there, and how does it increase the knowledge of anything to say that it was intelligently designed?
I mean, you're talking about laboratory documentation, everyday occurrence, where you have natural selection being verified continuously. And you're trying to explain this to people who are still arguing against the peppered moths of England in the 1800s.
Yeah, and again, I think it's so important that it was a revelation for me to realize that it's not that these people are ignorant of the science. There was a fairly good difference in how the polling goes if you ask people, is evolution how human came to be in their present form? Versus if you ask, do scientists believe that evolution is the result of? The difference in the number of people who say yes to those two questions is radically different. So it's not that they don't understand evolution at some level, probably in that sort of middle school science level, which is fine for most people. It's that they choose to, their identity is so bound up in believing that there's only one possible explanation for how human beings came to be, that, if there was no Adam, then there was no original sin, and so Jesus died for nothing, and so Christianity is complete bunk. Some people are smart enough to see the links between those things and say, stop. Even though I may know some of this to be true, at a deep level, my brain is going to reject the connecting the facts, even if I know the individual points. So rather than assuming that these people they're desperately in need of education, in a lot of cases, we're not going to reach them with the information because it's part of who they are. And I don't know a good solution to that. And I have sympathy for Lalandra trying to reach children, before those identity markers have been set, and trying to reach out to them on a rational level.
I actually had students say it like we were learning about mountains. We're going to learn about mountains today. And they're like, well, I don't need to know. God made
right.
Mountains. Yeah. And the incuriousness of this. Right. And talking to grown adults when you're trying to testify, and they just want to say, well, let me just let the teacher and the students talk about creationism. Right. And what value is that in a science classroom? What are we going to do? All sit there and gawk at a cell and say, oh, it's intricate. Too complex to be evolved. And then what do we do after that?
I have arguments with these people where I'm trying to explain evolution to them to get them to understand evolution. And you start with the definition of what it is, and that right there we've got a problem, because they will never use the word in the application that it belongs to. They have to redefine every term, right? Well, they'll call it variation, and they'll recognize it as that. But the definition of evolution, descent with inherent genetic modification, that's exactly what we're talking about here. They'll reject that. They'll never admit that that's a thing, right? Or they'll say, they'll put it only under the limitation. Well, that's only microevolution,
Right.
And then blur the limits of where it becomes macro, so you can get out of it. Natural selection, they argue against that. As I said, they're still going against the peppered moss of, what is it, Ketwell, and they're not going to accept any of the toxicology or virology that they're doing now, which are also dependent on natural selection being an actual fact.
Right.
And then, oh my God, what's the other example? But any of them, I mean, transitional species. For example, you get it. I was on a debate with some guy running a website where he was a microbiologist with a PhD, and he gives his own definition of what a transitional species is, and it's an accurate definition. I couldn't fault him. The definition that you put on your own website is correct. This is the way scientists would identify it. Here are 300 examples that meet the description, and you say that none have ever been found. Can you show me how any of these 300 don't meet that description? And he simply, it doesn't matter that they meet the description.
Right.
He's not going to admit that. And he admitted that he would not admit it, because if he admit it, then that means that would lead to him to believe in evolution. So how dishonest is that? That it's there, it's real, but you're not going to admit that it's real because it means that you believe that it's real.
Yeah, the greatest victim, though, is the person doing that to themselves. That honestly, the damage was done so early on that, again, their identity is bound up in it. There's a TED Talk, and I can't remember who the speaker is, but it's one of my favorites, and it's being wrong doesn't feel bad. Admitting that you're wrong is what feels bad, even if only to yourself. Being wrong feels like being right. You can't tell the difference between the two experiences, right up to the point where you have to face the fact that you're wrong. And our brains, our subconsciouses are very good at keeping us from ever having to face painful truths.
Are you talking about the backfire effect?
I'm not sure I've heard it as the backfire effect.
It's you get a very basic response, fight or flight response when your beliefs are threatened, and that's why a lot of times bombarding someone with facts backfires, because you trigger deep fear response.
Right, their resistance.
And
yeah,
they
absolutely.
very often say that you've strengthened their faith.
Right.
By proving them wrong, you've somehow made them more convinced that they're right. But I don't want to sidetrack too much. I mean, there are people that are watching this that actually want to hear about the evolution of sex.
Right, the biology.
I think we've gone too long into the weeds here.
Well, for me, this article we're all talking about is a quote mine of various scientists and creationists too, about how basically sex is somehow impossible, because here's one, I think. A Carl Zimmer quote: "Sex is not only unnecessary, but it ought to be a recipe for evolutionary disaster. For one thing, it is an inefficient way to reproduce, and sex carries other costs as well. By all rights, any group of animals that evolve sexual reproduction should be promptly outcompeted by non-sexual ones, and yet sex reigns. Why is sex a success despite all the disadvantages?"
And he's saying this against God's creation. I mean, he believes that God came up with sex.
Oh, this is a quote of Carl Zimmer.
No, Carl Zimmer's he's a good science writer. He's setting up the argument. Why is this such a difficult question? And I think scientists really, again, thought of this from the other side, which is, how do we explain to people that sex is a bizarre thing when you look at it from an objective perspective? Why do we bother to create males? Why do we have males? It doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it from that perspective. It's so normal to us that Carl Zimmer is painting this picture of contrast, and we've seized upon this, as you say, Lalandra. We've quote mined it out as though there were no next section, there were no answer to the question, and that's what they've carefully trimmed away.
The intelligent designers did that to Darwin too. He talked about the evolution of the eye, and how it was very difficult to explain. But then they cut the part out where he's like, well,
nevertheless, he cut it from nevertheless forward.
What reason tells me, and then
Yeah.
and then 4 pages of explanation that they don't. Somehow they never read that part.
For me, this is what you're saying. Like when you're saying that people probably know the information, it's not that they're scientifically illiterate.
Right.
At this level, when you got a doctoral degree and you're in microbiology, you're probably not like totally scientifically illiterate.
Right.
And the fact that he's read all these books and found these specific quotes lets me know that he's probably seen a lot of the answers to his questions, but he snipped them out. And but I think people like this take advantage of scientific illiteracy. Like most people are scientifically illiterate.
Right. Well, at this level, the level that they're talking about here, these are intricate, debates within a very specialized community of evolutionary biologists, which is, it's self-nested within molecular biology, which is itself nested within biology as a larger field. So, yeah, you're talking about an argument that would only be fully understood by a couple thousand people in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so you trim out all the explanations, all the answers, and if people are content to just sort of read the setup to the question, it's cutting everything from the nevertheless past that. They actually do a really good job of setting up the questions that are being asked. They just trim out every answer.
And it's like pseudoscience, and it seems to, like, I've had this experience. Like my son was at an after-school program at a Bible program at a school I taught at, and they're like, God said, let there be a dinosaur, and there's a dinosaur. So just like that, cow, dinosaur.
Right.
And so I went to my principal, and I was like, this is interfering with later on with the teaching of evolution, which is part of our standards. And her answer was, well, you have your opinion, and he has his. Right. Now, she's a lay person, and this pastor that's doing this is probably just repeating like the Can-Ham level apologetics. But that's where people like the True Origins, people who should know better. It sounds like they've got another side to this. There's both sides, right? There's the evolution side, and there's intelligent design side, because they put all these pseudo-scientific jargon in there, and it sounds convincing to people who can't distinguish, especially with how misleading it is.
So let's cover the points, and let's make sure that we get those out of the way, because I don't want the show to be over and we still haven't covered those. We have a number of criticisms that they brought up, and Lalandra has put a series of points in the text that we need to address. So what are the things that they brought up that you say where they've trimmed the answers out of the article? So the questions are there as if unanswered. What are the answers that they're missing? You're going to have to give us the questions along with them.
Okay. Well, the Carl Zimmer question, to sum up, is basically that sexual reproduction is inefficient when compared to asexual reproduction.
It is.
And that sexual reproducing organisms should quickly be outcompeted by asexually reproducing organisms.
Right.
So give the rest of the answer. But the rest of the story is, nevertheless.
The rest of the story, and they do kind of lay out the ideas, but then they say, oh, but that's been discredited, or this is on the ropes, or this idea is on the way out. But they hit a lot of them. They mentioned the Red Queen hypothesis. They mentioned the lottery principle, the idea that if you bought 1,000 lottery tickets, but it's the same number on every lottery ticket, versus sort of spreading out, buying 1,000 lottery tickets, but it's 1,000 different numbers, right? The diversity that you're creating through sexual reproduction as opposed to clonal reproduction means that you're more likely to hit on a successful strategy. And then it just sort of dies at the end. He says, it's fallen on hard times of late. It suggests that sex will be favored by a variable environment, but most environments are stable, as in the tropics. And you think to yourself, are most environments stable over geologic time? No. We live in Texas, and you can drive around limestone hills. And those limestone hills were formed from sea creatures falling to the bottom of the ocean that's now in the middle of Texas. Right? So things change, and things change on the short scale. They change on the long scale. Even if it's something as simple as summer to winter.
And what you're calling the tropics, right? On one side of the world is going to be very different than the tropics on the other side
Right.
of the world. And of course, any given place, over 5 million years is going to experience a whole lot of changes.
Even like you were saying in a cancer tumor,
Right.
the environment changes, so
Right.
cancer's evolving to
Right.
outcompete.
So they even set up the answer to that one. They just sort of, I don't know, tossed it out by making such a non sequitur. Global distribution of sex reveals that where environments are stable, sexual reproduction is most common. Okay. And then they move on to the tangled bank hypothesis, which is another very interesting one, though a little bit dated. And it says that, it's adding additional diversity to the ways that organisms interact with each other. And that's also kind of true. And then they come to the end, and why do some organisms continue to reproduce asexually while others have evolved the ability to reproduce sexually? And then they don't answer it. And the short answer is that there are evolutionary strategies. And not every organism has exactly the same optimal strategy for the kinds of things that they do. So a bacteria and a blue whale have to contend with very different situations and very different evolutionary pressures. And therefore, the bacteria, again, we talked about two different strategies, produces just an enormous number. Like, you can't even comprehend how many offspring it has. Whereas the blue whale may have, an offspring. I don't know what the gestation period of a blue whale is, but it's over a year.
Well, I mean, the blue whales tend to live for centuries.
Right.
And
So
even in an asexual
very different.
bacteria, isn't there still evolution going on without? They're not always a perfect clone through every generation, are they?
For the most part, they create diversity by having lots of individuals. And then the mistakes that they make become common enough, right? They're exploring different possible combinations of genetic elements by creating a lot of clones of themselves and allowing for a certain amount of mistakes. Whereas, again, we use sexual reproduction. We exchange nucleic acids, DNA, so that we end up with more diversity through recombination. Right? It's two different strategies to accomplish the same thing, which is the ability to adapt.
And you're mixing a lot more up with sexual reproduction, because you still have like those copying errors through the reproductive cycle. And on top of that, you're mixing two different individuals' genetic information. So I mean, that's your answer, isn't it? What the advantage is over asexual reproduction?
Yeah, depending on the rate at which you can reproduce, there would be more pressure for sexual reproduction, or more pressure for asexual. I'm just going to pull the number up here. Mm-hmm. If you reproduce every 4 hours, that means in a 24-hour day, you have 64 times as many. By the end of a week, let me do the math on that. So that's 2 raised to the 42 power. You're looking at about 4 trillion offspring at the end of a week from one E. coli bacteria. In fact, some E. coli can reproduce even more rapidly than that. Of course, they don't actually produce 4 trillion offspring because there's not enough resources to do that. But, 4 trillion in a week, as opposed to 6 billion, it took us a long time to get to that number. They have a strategy that is off limits to us. So it would be expected that there would be different ways that they've adapted over time.
Even with that advantage in producing that much offspring, aren't there microorganisms that go extinct because of some sort of environmental pressure?
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. On the other hand, the bacteria are pretty good at going everywhere. Mm-hmm. And with enough time, they've managed to adapt to a lot of things.
I would argue that the speed of evolution is by itself a huge drive for sexual reproduction because it is so much faster. That organisms evolve so much faster through sexual reproduction, and of course that gives a huge advantage. You get a lot more diversity, and that ties into your lottery thing. When you have a different selection of genes, and then the environment changes somehow drastically, or there's a new predator or something like that. In some plant where a different kind of ant shows up that wasn't in that area before, and you have defenses against it, but the other plants don't. Something along those lines. That would seem to be advantageous enough to warrant sexual reproduction. But then, of course, we're talking about people who refuse to admit that anything evolves. They'll call it variety instead.
You have a background in viral evolution, particularly the family that includes HIV, the lentiviruses. And something a lot of people don't know about HIV is that most of the virions, these are the protein and the nucleic acid in the middle of the RNA, most of them are non-functional broken junk. It produces these copies of virus that are non-infectious. And it's only about every 1 out of every 100 particles that it produces that are actually a fully intact, fully functioning HIV virion. And that amount doesn't vary by much, but it's willing to accept this really high rate of failure because that 100th one is sufficient to make it to the next generation. So it accepts this really high failure and mutation rate because it makes it incredibly fast as an evolver. And again, our immune systems are trying to keep up with HIV up until the point where they just lose that battle because HIV is a super mutator.
That's the answer to like asexual reproduction in microorganisms. When you're talking about diseases,
right,
they're evolving, and so like multicellular things that they infect have to keep evolving.
Mm-hmm.
And the multicellular are reproducing by sexual reproduction most of the time, in 90% of, probably more than that, of the cases. So they have to keep evolving because things that are killing them keep evolving.
Right. Yep. Sexual reproduction definitely has a cost, even if it's only the need to attract and make contact with a mate. And you can imagine, in human history, the amount of money that's been spent on sports cars and dinners out and maybe a bottle of wine. It's very expensive for organisms, even single-celled organisms, to locate a mate. They have to secrete pheromones. They have to detect whether or not the organism that they've come into contact with is compatible. And so there are these mating strains with yeast or bacteria, and there a whole set of mechanisms evolved to determine whether or not those are compatible mating strains.
Mm-hmm. And if they are, they can continue.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not, that's a good thing in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although may be some lonely human somewhere who spent all this money on a date that's not going to sexually reproduce.
Well, it kind of serves the place of the blood test before you get married to make sure you're not first cousins, because the two bacteria, and it's not really sex at that point, it's still conjugation. You mentioned that earlier, Aron. That the mating strain markers, the A and alpha for yeast, and for bacteria, there's some other F prime and F positive. That the point is that if they're clonal, if they are close relatives of each other, they split off a few minutes ago from the same parent cell, then you don't want them recombining with each other because there's nothing to be gained, right? There's no diversity difference between them. Mm-hmm. So it's to avoid the Alabama incest issue.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure that we'd covered this other thing when I mentioned about gametogenesis earlier, and I was looking at one of the points from the article that these how is it that these gamete, sperm, and egg conveniently evolved so that they each contain half the normal chromosome number of somatic cells? Fair question. And is there an answer that they've trimmed out of that we haven't already covered?
Sorry, they fuse together to form the somatic cells?
The way the question is worded, the way that the article worded it was, how is it these gametes, cells or eggs and sperm, conveniently evolved so that they each contain half the normal chromosome number of somatic body cells?
Oh,
That's a good one. I mean, do you guys have thoughts on it?
Nope. Nope.
Okay.
This is why I'm talking to a biologist now.
Hey, all right. I'm going to try to avoid too much jargon, but you got to allow me Ploidy. All right. So we are diploid organisms, right? We have 2 copies of each chromosome, total of 46, 23 of each, right? We have 2 copies, except for our sex chromosomes where we have 1 X and 1 Y. In the case of Aron and me, I'm making some assumptions about here, or 2 X's in the case of Lalandra. But ploidy isn't always diploid. So your sperm or your egg are haploid. They're single copy of each chromosome. And again, if we're talking about insects, a drone is haploid. They're a haplodiploid species. That means they sort of within the same species, you have some that are 2N and some that are 1N. If you get into plants, it's even more complicated. Some parts of the wheat that we all eat when we eat bread, if we're not gluten intolerant, which most of us aren't, when you grind that up, you're grinding up some parts of the plant are 6N. They're hexaploid. They have 6 copies of each chromosome, and 4N in other cases. When you're eating strawberries, you could have any kind of ploidy. It could be anything from 2N to 16N. So
random.
yeah, ploid. Well, not random, but different strains. You may get a big one that's super polyploid. Ploidy is really agriculturally very significant, but it's also kind of hidden. It's something that we're just now, I'm talking the last 4 or 5 years, coming to realize about humans, is that we have variable numbers of different parts of our chromosomes that aren't 2 copies. We may have 2.5 copies or 3 copies or 4 copies. And because it's not associated with anything you would notice about someone, these are not people who have Down syndrome. These are not people with 6 fingers on 1 hand. That unless we randomly test people as they walk through the door of a hospital, we don't realize the types of ploidy changes or copy number variations that people have.
Is
So
diploid a default?
it's not. It is in some species, and it's almost always even, right? Because you can imagine every time you create daughter cells during meiosis, you have this sort of pulling apart. And then it's very hard to do that with an odd number, right? Which is why they're almost always even. But 2N seems to have been fixed on fairly early on in our lineage, but not in others. So the plants, yeast, for example, depends on the stress environment that they're in, what ploidy they have. So it's not unusual for organisms to go through a haploid phase and a diploid phase. Fungus do it. They're very, very famous for it. And you wouldn't really think of that as sperm and egg. It's spore, or it's the vegetative portion and the fruiting portion, right? So haploid and diploid changes have been going on in our evolutionary history for a very long time.
Is haploid maybe a neotenous trait? Maybe, and that's where it came from?
I don't know.
And then that's where sexual reproduction evolved from, to neotenous cells?
Yeah, potentially. It's so broadly distributed, it's kind of hard to track it down, and the strategies are also different. So again, you may have a diploid fruiting body and a haploid vegetative state. And I'm thinking here of slime molds. It's been a long time since I thought about slime molds.
I think about slime molds all the time.
Do you really? Only when I'm in the shower. So it's not that uncommon a strategy to go from haploid to diploid. It's just in our case that we sort of built up our diploid stage a lot, and our body mass is 99.9% diploid, and only the sperm and the egg that we produce are the haploid stage. So it's not that it didn't exist a long time ago. It's not that it doesn't exist in all of the eukaryotic cells at some point or another. It's that ours is a very specialized form of it.
What you get, every explanation that you've given today, and really that I've ever heard in biology, is that even when we don't know what the full explanation is, it is evidently not an intelligent design. There is too much haphazard variable nonsense. With the four copies may exist in a single person, so forth. All these different organisms that polyploidy for what? They
Right.
just and why are some things parthenogenic, sometimes not? Why can't we parthenogenically reproduce? What's
Right.
up with that? And if it's so expensive and it's so inefficient, then why don't we just why did God want to do it this way if this way doesn't
Yeah.
work? And so why
And
are they defeating
there's
their own
that.
argument this way?
God's like unicellular. And
Well, what he is a little bit
God is a slime mold.
absent-minded, because
Yeah.
he made the male and female for all other animals, but for some reason forgot when it came to Adam that, oh, was I gave you testicles. Why did I do that? Oh yes, now I remember.
After all that whole article, they quote mine a bunch of people, and they quote people. They quote people quote mining people. Their answer at the very bottom, it looks like a footnote. All right, if it isn't evolution, okay, guys, then what is it? Their answer at the very bottom is, so the highly complex and intricate manner in which the human body reproduces offspring is not a matter of mere chance or a lucky roll of the dice. Rather, it is the product of an intelligent creator, in caps. Albert Einstein said it well when he stated, God does not play dice with the universe.
I thought Einstein said it well, that from the perspective of a Christian, I have always been an atheist.
So that's, after all of that quote mining and quoting people who are quote mining, that's their answer in two sentences, that it's God does not play dice, and it's not random or lucky, not mere chance.
Now,
I agree that it's not
understand.
mere chance. That's a true statement.
I see the
Yeah.
evolution of sex,
I'm sorry.
as biologically interesting. Of course, I don't ever see in this or in any other application where the evolutionists are scrambling to come up with an excuse or an explanation or one of their many theories. At least we have something that qualifies as an actual theory. We don't just say, "Oh, you can't explain it, therefore magic." But can you give a summary for the evolution of sex? Just the simplest way you can present it, so that we can actually say that we've said this in a way that somebody will understand.
I'm not a science communicator. Lalandra's the teacher. Simple is not what I do. I think, again, the idea of organisms that are facultatively sexual. In other words, when it suits them, when it's appropriate, they switch from asexual to sexual reproduction. Tells us an awful lot about, it's not part of a plan or a design, that there are advantages but also costs.
Now, the way you just described it sounds like it's being designed. That people don't understand that within one pond you have a collection of fish, some of whom reproduce sexually, some of whom reproduce asexually, and then you introduce this new thing that wasn't there before, and now you have parasites or whatever, and now the asexual population has dwindled to almost nothing, and the sexual reproducers have the advantage. This isn't because they chose a strategy. They're completely unaware that there even is sexual versus asexual reproduction. They have no idea. They have no idea what's even going on. But the way that we have to describe this is to use terms that sound like, strategy. Right. Obviously, the word strategy really doesn't apply here. It just mathematically works out that way when you're looking at the population mechanics.
Yeah, the appearance of design is again like that river rock, the rock you pull out of the river and say, what a perfectly shaped rock to be in that river. You're getting it entirely backwards, right? The rock didn't always look that way. It adapted to its situation, and we are, of course, smuggling in some intent there, as in, the rock did something conscious, because that's how we talk. That's the language we have to use. It's horrible. This is why science communicators are better at this than scientists, is you have to have the discipline of what you say, knowing that it will be quote mined and used against you. So not my strength at all.
It's exactly what you're talking about. Like they always look at it like the way it looks now, and it must have always been that way.
Right.
And rather than looking at it like a gradual process, like that was one of my problems when I was an old Earth creationist growing up in Houston, is that I saw a snake and a dog, and you know how creationists sometimes think that why if evolution is true, why is there not a crocoduck or whatever, and it seems so separate on its own. But then if you look at something like a pangolin, it's a mammal with scales. It's not all of a sudden there was a dog and all of a sudden there was a snake. You know, it's not. It's like if your family, you're different from your grandparents, and it wasn't all of a sudden you sprang fully formed you. You know, you have some other traits, you have other things, and you have mutations. You know, they always look at it the way it is now. The same thing with what you're talking about with their question, why sex at all? I mean, they're just focused on diploid the way it is. They're not looking at it like gradually or like variations in different ways that chromosomes are numbered.
I had a creationist tell me once upon a time that he didn't come from goo. I said, "Oh, did your parents reproduce asexually?"
There's a Douglas Adams essay that I love. He's talking about a puddle. Wakes up one morning and finds itself, in a hole perfectly shaped to the puddle, and it says to itself clearly, "This hole was designed for me to be in it." Right? And of course, that's perfectly intuitive. If you wake up one day and find yourself, perfectly in a hole that's perfectly shaped for you, because that's how you think. You're to a certain extent self-centered in that case. You think things and how they relate to you, rather than sort of how you were shaped by the things around you.
Yeah.
And it's a case of top-down versus bottom-up. The hole is perfectly puddle-shaped because the puddle has adapted to the hole, not because the hole was created for the puddle to be in it. And it's the same case with the things that we consider to be normal are not normal because they're special. They're normal because they're what we experience. We are shaped by them. They're normal because they're normal to us, right? And that's what we kind of have to get our heads around. That's why these Carl Zimmer quotes are misquoted. We have to get people to recognize that sex is an interesting question in biology. Sort of why are some animals sexually reproducing and others are still asexual today? It's a great question for a biologist to ask. It's not a great point to be making if you're trying to prove creationism, because there's no explanation offered. There's no insight that comes to you by assuming that God created the man and woman. Okay, and then what? And what can we conclude from that?
No application either.
There's no application.
Why is it that the spotted hyena female is well? Let me say, how do I phrase this? Why does the female spotted hyena have a bigger dick than the male?
Why?
Is this a pun? It sounds like the setup for a good joke.
Yeah.
No, if you want to talk about intelligent design, right? Look at the hyenas. I mean, because they're actually it's a female-dominated society, probably because they have a bigger dick. The female hyena has this huge, overly extended clitoris. So, yeah, and when they give birth, it's such an uncomfortable process, an impossible process with this massive clitoris, that it causes the hyena to have to chew off her own clitoris to give birth. At what point do we start saying, well, there's the glory of God? What an intelligent designer we have.
They're probably cursed. They did something.
I'm sure we'll
What,
find.
did they fall too separately?
Yeah, there was a separate fall for hyenas.
Well.
Oh, they had to pay for Eve. I get it. They have to have painful childbirth.
Yeah, we were going to do a video once upon a time, just not on the evolution of sex, but how sex went wrong. And the hyena was one of the examples that we were going to go to. There was actually a whole bunch of, because as you know, as a biologist, there's a whole bunch of different animals that have really screwed up sex lives or reproductive.
Nature is horrifying. Yeah.
Yes.
It is.
And that's another thing about the intelligent design thing. I mean, the simple observation that Darwin made, and then so somehow because he observed this, evolution is tainted, because he said that nature is red in tooth and claw. And it's not because he has observed evolution. If your God existed, then it's your God's fault that this is still a fact either way. You know, that
most of human history has been us trying to stop acting like animals, right? That's sort of how we find ourselves.
Don't we act worse than animals, just in general?
We were talking about that, man.
Animals are pretty evil.
Yeah, my kids were saying that too. My son was saying that dolphins rape and stuff like that. And I was wondering, maybe with the cruelty of us being cruel and sometimes other intelligent animals being cruel, I think it's a product of boredom when you're highly intelligent. You often come up with these cruel ways to entertain yourself.
Yeah, somebody just sent me one of these, get involved and sign our petition things having to do with some culture somewhere that ritually drowns whales by attaching weights to them.
Right.
How is that not evil?
You
know, look at shark fin soup. Look at all the rhinos that we were killing by cutting the horns off because we think that somehow grinding the rhino, which is the exact same chemical construct as our fingernails, right. This is somehow going to cure. It will give us greater prowess in bed somehow, and so that's why this species has to go extinct, because of this thing that it can't do. So
yeah, I don't know. I study viruses. I have to say they're not nice. It's not intentional cruelty. I think that's the only difference, is that we're the only ones who are supposed to know better, who are supposed to sort of rise above what our instincts tell us and use our ability to learn and adapt in a different way.
No more Mr. Nice Virus.
No. Well, and to be fair, most viruses are harmless. That's their goal in life, ultimately.
I would have thought that the greater advantage, speaking in terms of population mechanics and so forth, would be that a virus not kill the host.
Right. Long term. Again, two strategies, and using the word strategy selectively, you can either spread so fast that you get everywhere, or you can spread slowly and not raise any alarms, not take too much, steal just a little. And that is a great way to set a precedence, right?
And curiously, that seems to be the strategy the Neanderthals used, which is why they didn't make it.
Well, see, lots of unsuccessful strategies.
That's why there's 7 billion of us.
You were saying with the AIDS virus, like however many it takes to have an actual one that is infectious, and it's not a perfect process. So some viruses kill their hosts, but their process is evidently working for them if they're still around.
Yep.
All right. Well, Concordance, I want to thank you very much for coming on and trying to do a little bit of layman speak, because
struggle. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can talk science on some occasions, but this is clearly beyond me. So I very much appreciate you coming on to help.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm going to close it up, but I want you to give you the opportunity to say one last thing. And Lalandra, I want to make sure that you've covered every point that you need to bring up.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So
I don't have anything I want to contribute.
Oh no.
I will say that if you're interested in an older video series I did on one of the authors of this particular article, Brad Harrub. I documented my exchange with Brad Harrub through a series of videos, some of my least viewed because they're pretty science heavy. But I did address some of his central points. I had a chance to talk with him after the talk. Recorded some of it, but not all of it. And he's an interesting guy.
So you met him, and so what did he? What did you?
met both of the authors.
I met both of them in the same room, in fact.
What did they do when you like gave them that information? Did they answer your?
They pulled a gish gallop on me. They went off to human populations and doubling times, and was never able. And again, this is why, again, you need SciComm people. You need people who are really good at debunking creationist arguments, because I wasn't prepared to reorient them back to the argument at hand.
Maybe it's not you. Maybe
I'm like a dog after a bone. They throw something out there and I'm saying, "Huh, that's an interesting question," and then you lose your momentum.
Well, I'll tell you what happened with me. I met
you. Maybe it's they're intellectually dishonest.
Well, that too.
That's going to be my default position for a long time. I met Ray Bolin of I can't remember which ministry he works for, but there was a public debate down here in Dallas, and so I met him, and he was complaining that the debate was over intelligent design. Is intelligent design science? And he criticized his opponent in that debate for making it sound like a conspiracy, to change the wording for creationism to creationists and creationism in the Pandas and People textbook. He said it made it sound like it was a conspiracy, that once it became illegal to teach creationism, that they changed the name to call it intelligent design. And I said, well, I had a chance to talk to him after this debate, and I said, if you're aware that it's illegal and you conspire with your friends to conceal to conceal the criminal act you're still conducting, that meets the definition of a criminal conspiracy.
That's a good point.
And he said, no, that's just a way of working within the law. No.
I have a story too.
Referring to Grand Theft Auto as borrowing is not a way of working within the law.
Right.
I met Frank Turek, because the man who wrote I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist.
Right.
And one of his arguments was love. Where did love come from? That's a common one. I don't know if C.S. Lewis was the first one to make that argument, but a lot of people are influenced by C.S. Lewis on that. And anyways, I go, well, my dog, one of the most loving, loyal, wouldn't betray me for anything, never read a Bible. I explain that. And they just go somewhere in their mind. I don't know if they're putting on their armor of God or putting on their biblical glasses.
I saw somebody wearing an armor. I saw somebody wearing a shirt yesterday that was the armor of God. And I want to get a shirt that says the armor of God. And I just want to have a bunch of holes in it.
Lalandre, I've seen people have debates about Star Trek episodes and Lord of the Rings lore and, mythology, characters on Harry Potter, all those kinds of sort of fan fiction arguments. People create realities in our heads, and then we're forced to defend them. And the more people attack, the more defenses we create. It's something Michael Shermer made a really good point about, is that intelligent people believe weird things because we're so good at rationally defending things that we arrived at for irrational reasons.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that we have this truth filter in our heads. It's that we are really good at rationalizing why we believe something to be true.
Exactly.
Right? So you can find an intelligent creationist who will just argue forever because it's not touching their core belief.
Have you ever read Morton's Demon?
No.
Maxwell's Demon, I think, is some sort of quantum physics thing or something. And instead this Glenn Morton creationist used to be a young earth creationist, wrote books, all that stuff. But he was a geophysicist, so every day he saw disproof of what he was saying. And he said it's like he had a demon in his mind. And whenever information came in, it would block the information for the preferred conclusion. People, I don't know if it's willful even sometimes, but if they have this really elaborate system in there, it's really hard to get past their defenses.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, and that I see it as willful. I see it as structured. It is as if it's like the book, The God Virus. There is actually a self-defense mechanism that the belief system has for how people rationalize what they're believing, and how certain keywords will cause a conditioned response, so to speak, so that you can never get through that defense. Anyway, I want to thank you once again for coming on. I'll go ahead and end the show so we don't drag on forever. I don't know if we're ever going to run into you again. You're still in Texas, right?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah, some of the time, most of the time.
All right.
You should come with us to testify sometime.
Sounds good.
Time.
Yeah. Next, that's not a bad idea. Lalandra's looking at a schedule of things that they're going to be, they're going to be testifying. We're going to see if there's anything relevant to what we do, and if there's anything relevant to what you do, we'll try to drag you in.
There is a whole bunch of stuff that is secular related, but the one that they were trying to sneak in, creationism, intelligent design, died in committee.
Yeah, I think we killed it.
Good.
No, we killed it.
Yeah, slay the dragon.
All right. Thank you very much. Good night.